Correctly identifying the selection range and describing the contents of the material that Beat Detective is working with is critical to achieving predictable results in any of its workflows. Because Beat Detective not only identifies raw transients within the audio region, but interpolates their relative bar beat position by counting and measuring the distance between each beat trigger against the selection range, if you don't identify the selection range accurately, you're wasting your time from the get-go. All Beat Detective workflows outside the fill and crossfade require you to define the selection range you are working with. So this is a logical first step regardless of whatever mode you're going to use. So the selection here does not change as we move through the different modes. Now, making the selection is actually fairly easy if you follow a few simple steps. Once I've selected the material with the selector tool or the grabber tool here, what I can do is if the material is already on the grid, that is played to a click, or it's a loop that's already in the time of the session, I can simply hit the capture selection button. And what this does is it basically copies what's here in start end to here. Just by moving the selection, this never updates itself. So in the case of working with something that's already on the grid, let's say a drummer played to a click or you brought in a loop, it's the same tempo. Just select the material and hit capture selection. When you work on a new section, what you want to do is go back and recapture the selection. So if you moved your selection, like so, you'd want to recapture that. You always want to make sure that what you're working with here matches what you're working with in the edit window. Now, in the case of working with stuff that is not on the grid, let's say a freely recorded performance or maybe some material that's not at the session's tempo, I have something here in the tracks list. I can see here that if I just make this selection on the grid and I capture that, it's saying it starts at measure 2 but ends at measure 5 beat 3. And that's just not the case. If we go ahead and listen to this and count the beats, that's 4 bars relative. So while it starts at 2, it's actually going to end at 6. And so I would type that in manually. Now that doesn't match the session start end length. That's okay, because when I go in to do things like region separation and conform, it actually marks the appropriate relative points within the transients that it identifies. The main thing to remember is that the selection range defines the relative section of time you're working with inside of Beat Detective. Now, many times after you've made your selection, you might have to go in and modify the head or tail of that selection. So if I go back to my original example that's already on the grid, and I capture this, what you might have to do is zoom in and actually modify the head and tails of the selection to incorporate the first downbeat and not overlap into the next downbeat of the next measure. A lot of times drummers play ahead of the beat, and this is usually the case when you're quantizing live drums. And what happens is when you just select on the grid, you kind of cut into half of the downbeat there, and you might cut into the first half of the downbeat of the next measure that you're working on. So you want to be careful with that. Once you have a solid selection, when in doubt, just go ahead and listen to it and count those beats out and make sure that your start and end matches with that. You're going to want to set your time signature. So if it's anything but 4/4, you're going to want to go in and modify that. And then you're going to want to go set the contains field. So right now I have it set to a 16th note. That means there aren't any faster rhythms than a 16th note. So if there were any 30 seconds in there, that's pretty rare. Or even if I said, you know what, there really aren't any 16th note rhythms in here, let's just go for an 8th note. If there's any triplets, I would check the 3 box. And you need to tell Beat Detective this, because again, what it's doing is it's not only identifying the transients, but it's measuring the relative distance between them to identify what the relative position of each transient is relative to the bar. So is this the and of 3? Is this measure 2? Is this the upbeat of measure 3 beat 4? That's the idea here. So if you don't tell it exactly what you have in your selection, it's not able to correctly interpolate that information. I generally like to start with choosing a 16th note, and even if it's just eighth notes, choosing 16th notes is gonna work. Now that we have accurately made a selection, we can move on to identifying trigger points. Remember, spending a little extra time at this early stage really pays off later on down the line. I've learned the hard way many times, getting to the end of a Beat Detective workflow, only to realize everything is screwed up because of a bad selection definition.